Today we're going to explore how diaries help us write history. Some of you may have kept a diary when you were younger, perhaps you're still keeping it. And there's a variety of things that people write in their diaries. I know that I wrote diaries about what happened in school and things I didn't really want to tell my friends or my mom. I wrote really bad poetry, and I wrote about heartbreak. Nothing really particularly interesting, except maybe someday, 200 years from now, there'll be details about what I wrote, not so much about the stupid heartbreaks, but about the world that I described as I was writing about my stupid heartbreaks that will interest a historian. And the diaries that we're going to be looking at over the next couple of minutes are very much like that. So this is an image of the filming of a story based on a diary. Perhaps you recognize this girl and this guy. This is Anna Frank, a quite famous young girl who kept a diary that most of you have read in high school or middle school. This is Ernesto Guevara, better known as Che Guevara. This is obviously in his pre-revolutionary phase, but by the scowl on his face, he was either already pretty mad or had indigestion. And this is the filming of Martha Ballard's story, a midwife in the mid-18th century US or America at the time. I want to start with Martha Ballard's diary. This is a page of her diary. So you can see part of the complications when you are working with diaries, just as when you're reading old letters, is to be able to understand what is actually being written there. Martha Ballard's diary is as much a record keeping of her day-to-day life, her accounts. But more important, not only was she a woman who knew how to write and kept notes in the middle of the 18th century, she was a midwife. So the stories she tells are about a particular part of life that we don't have a lot of insight in, certainly not for the 18th century. Her diary spans the years from 1785 to 1812. It's not an extremely long period, but it's really long enough to give us a really good perspective, especially since she wrote every day for 27 years. And that's an enormous amount of short entries that can really build up our perspective over a period of time. And this is a period of time, this is early modern America, in which the history of great men is largely told. I mean, this is the formation of the American state. Her diary was not in any way a secret. We knew this diary existed. But a lot of the details that she wrote about were considered to be repetitive and uninteresting. For example, here's an entry from October 15th, 1789. So if you read this entry, it starts with the date, where she is mostly, and what the weather's like. And it's a fairly innocuous entry about the fact that a few ladies came to visit her. And then the last part of that entry is that there's been a rape. And that this particular woman has been raped, not just by one man who happens to be a judge, but by many men. So it's really interesting, considering what she's writing about, that the details were considered to be repetitive and uninteresting by most historians of American political and cultural history. The amazing thing about this diary is that it took a very committed historian to extract from it the rich history that it is now associated with. There's a great PBS movie based on this diary. The entries continue. Let me give you a little bit more details. There's been a court, so there's been a trial of Judge North over the raping of not just the woman that was mentioned in the previous diary entry, but other women. And he was acquitted. She was surprised because she'd heard the stories of rape from other women. Women in the 18th century existed, had daily relationships with their husbands and the men in their family, but really their environment was a feminine one. And to her, it was a great surprise that he was acquitted. To most men, it probably wasn't. And this speaks volumes to the role of women in this time in history, not just as participants in the domestic sphere, as midwives, as social networkers, as important domestic social networkers, but then also the social standing of women at this time, when they were clearly did not have the rights, or certainly not the respect that women in many respects still, in many ways, still struggle to acquire today. Other entries are a little bit less harsh and serious of tone. For example, this one. Again, she starts with a date, where she is, the weather, and then I just love this sentence. Mr. Ballard went to meeting, Dolly is unwell, puking in the night. So if ever you wondered how long that term has been used, it's a very old English word. The diary is a fantastic exploration of many aspects of life that would have been impossible to get at without this intimate record keeping. Laurel Thatcher Ulrich found, or she didn't find the diary, she knew the diary existed like many other historians, and she proceeded to explore it in a way that would give voice to the silent work of ordinary people. And really that is what is great about this kind of source. The notion that ordinary people would have an experience that could contribute to what we consider to be history is quite new. If you look at historical works before the 1970s, you're not going to see a lot of reference to the poor, except as a social problem. Marginal populations, women, are really not part of the story. The indigenous histories are largely studied from the perspective of anthropology and archaeology. And so it really takes a radical perspective change to include ordinary people into the story and into history. And Laurel Thatcher, who teaches at Harvard, has often said of her world that she's really concerned in bringing and demonstrating and showing how the private worlds and the public event connect, that they don't exist on their own, that the public events that have, so for such a long time, were really the concern of historians writing about wars and presidents and large-scale political events, don't exist, cannot exist, without private events that a historian really needs to be able to explore. And this is what she manages to explore with this diary, and it becomes a foundational text in modern women's history, but also science history, the history of the healing arts, and the popular history of early modern America. There's a very different approach to storytelling in Anne Frank's diary. First of all, it's a key piece of Holocaust history. Anne Frank is a young girl who's writing while hidden away from Nazis in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. She is hiding because she's Jewish, and the Nazis have invaded the Netherlands, and if found, her and her family and the other people who are hiding would be sent to concentration camps, which is in fact what happens. The diary ends when her family is found in their hiding place, and they're all sent to die in concentration camps. This is a page from one of the versions of her diary, and this is one of the things we need to think about. Diaries don't just exist necessarily in one version. Now, Martha Ballard's diary is one diary. She was not rewriting the diary as she wrote it. It was a simple record-keeping tool. For Anne Frank, the diary was more than just that. On what I've printed here is an excerpt from the announcement by the exiled Dutch Minister for Education, Art and Science that he made from London, calling on all citizens to preserve ordinary documents, to keep their letters, keep a diary, to create, in order so that they could create an archive for posterity of what happened during World War II. So in March 1944, Anne starts to rewrite her diary. She's been writing the diary since they've been in captivity in the early 1940s. She's found soon after. So the announcement happens in March 1944. In September 1944, the family is found. They're all sent to concentration camps. Anne dies probably as a consequence of a typhus outbreak at the camp she was ultimately sent to in Bergen-Belsen. And we don't know when she died, but she did not survive the war. Her father, on the other hand, did survive, and he was liberated and reunited with friends in Amsterdam who had saved Anne's diary after they'd been taken away. And he translates the diary to German to show Swiss friends after the war. And in 1947, so 3 years after the diary stopped being written in, and 2 years after Anne dies, the diary is published in Dutch. And it is a success almost overnight. This is a perspective into what happened during the war and what happened to Jews during the war that will resonate across the world, across generations. This is the perspective from a young girl, someone who does not have a stake in this except survival. And it is, to this day, still read and powerful. When you're reading that diary, excerpts from the diary, you do need to remember that what you're reading is not exactly what she wrote at the time. It was rewritten at least twice before it was published. Once, Anne rewrote it, right? After March 1944, when she knew that there was an intent to create an archive for posterity of the experience of people during the war, she rewrote the entire diary. She didn't just start writing it knowing that there might be an audience. She just rewrote the entire thing. And then her father, he translated it and then he rewrote it. So at least twice, if not 3 times. And that tells us that diaries are not neutral stories. There is really no such thing as a neutral story. And when we know that diaries have been rewritten, then we need to take that into consideration when we analyze them as historical sources. So this is Che Guevara, the uncomfortable young man that I showed you earlier. This is the English version of his most famous diary, or the cover of the English version of his diary, the Motorcycle Diaries. These are notes that he took while traveling throughout Latin America. Now, the notes became so unbelievably famous that, and are so compelling to read, that a film was made of it not so long ago. You might have seen the film, and if not, I highly recommend it. And it was translated into Italian and French and English, obviously, German, Chinese, Japanese, you name the language. The Motorcycle Diaries, the text has been translated multiple times, and since the movie exists, that movie has been watched across the world. Now, what is so compelling about the diary? Well, it's written by, or at least the notes were taken when Che Guevara was very young, in his early 20s, traveling throughout Latin America. And he, at the end of his diary, says that this is the trip that made him who he would become. That at the end of this trip through South America, after seeing the misery and the abuse by capitalists, by foreign capitalists, of indigenous Latin Americans, Che Guevara became an idealist about a unified Latin America, a communist Latin America. And so the diary is very often seen, in a sense, as a privileged perspective into the formation of the man that Che Guevara would become. The Motorcycle Diaries are really very much a part of the myth about this man. And you've probably all seen this photograph taken by Corda early on in the Cuban Revolution. Che Guevara dies at 39 in 1967. Alberto Granado, who's the friend with whom he traveled, dies much, much later. He's 89 years old. He dies in 2011. He was actually an advisor on the film that you might have seen. So how do you think the man who traveled with Che Guevara on the trip might have influenced the telling of the story in the film? Here are some photographs from the trip. 2 young men crossing the Amazon, riding an old bike, the Poderosa, fixing the Poderosa. The Poderosa means the powerful one, and the number of times that they had to fix that motorbike suggests that she was ever anything but that. Now here's a picture of them much later, or you can tell that it's later because Che has a beard, so this is we're in Cuba at the time, and Alberto Granados joined him there. And in the corner, you see a picture of Gabriel García Bernal, who played Che Guevara, with the old Alberto Granados in the presentation of the film that he was such an important advisor to. Now, the notes that are the basis for the diary were written in 1952. Che dies in 1967, and the diary is first published in 1993. Do you think there might be some meddling of time with these diaries? Do they even count as diaries? These were notes taken on a trip a long time ago, and when Che Guevara put together the notes about the trip, we're not clear whether he wanted them to be published or not. But we do know that he is deeply involved in a revolutionary movement in Cuba when he's putting these notes together. So the time, even the time between 1952 and 1967, will affect how Che Guevara writes the diary, right? And especially since this diary wasn't, in a sense, a diary we assume is a record that is kept in real time, a little bit like Martha Ballard, who took notes at the end of each day about what had happened in that day. Or perhaps even Anne Frank, who's rewriting the diary, is writing and rewriting very close to the time of the events. Che Guevara is not writing very close to the events. And then there are a couple more years between his death and the time of the first publication in which any matter of people who have a stake in the memorialization and the mythical memory of Che Guevara that might have affected the diary. So here are some photographs that exist, and they're emblematic about the role of Che Guevara in Cuba. He's on the currency, he's on the face of buildings, there are monuments to him. He is really an important part of the iconography of the Cuban Revolution. And the Cuban Revolution is an essential part of both the history of Latin America, the history of the relationship of the United States with Latin America, the history of the ideology of the United States versus a communist ideology, which during a significant part of the world's history was the root of the conflict between East and West. The communism that Che Guevara and Fidel Castro fought for was the antithesis to the ideals of American capitalism and democracy. And so Che Guevara really is an important figure, whether you believe in his ideals or not, but he's a very important figure of opposition to imperial Western power. The Motorcycle Diaries is the last of his books to be published. He published a lot. And a lot of his works were published before he died and after he died and continued to be read for that purpose because he is such an emblem of an alternative to what was during the Cold War, but is certainly today the dominant worldview. When you're reading the notes in the Motorcycle Diaries, remember that a lot of time passed between those notes, the basis for what those notes are being written, and their publication. And so one of the things you need to remember when you're analyzing a diary as a historical source is to think about who wrote it, when they wrote it, and whether you can confirm both that it was written when it was written and it was written by who it was written by. The other thing you need to think about is whether this is a private document or if it was intended to be read. And this goes for any document that you look at, but especially when you're thinking about diaries. Martha Ballard was not really thinking about anybody reading her document, her diary, but I don't know that she was particularly concerned about it either. Anne Frank was clearly in the second writing, right? In the first writing of her diary, perhaps not, but when she started rewriting her diary, she was writing it with an eye towards it being published. And considering the fact that the Motorcycle Diaries were not published during Che Guevara's life, it's not clear who he was writing for, what he was thinking about when he was rewriting it, and certainly whose influence was most important on the final version that we read, which is why you really need to think about how many translations or rewrites have preceded the version that you're reading. And you might never be able to know exactly how many there are, But you really do need to, at the very least, consider the possibility that what you are reading is not a pure version, right? And if it's not, can you access it? Does it exist? Is the original version still in existence? That's a really important thing to take into account when you are analyzing a diary. These are the questions, the 4 questions I've put there that you need to be able to answer. You might not have an answer, but you have to at least think about these questions. And if you don't have an answer, then you need to look beyond the diary into other primary sources and secondary sources to explore the context of the diary, to flesh out the details that you can't immediately answer. Who still writes diaries these days? And come to that, who writes letters? And this is just the thought I want to leave you with, which is in the context of technology. What sources are future historians going to be working with?